At a Thanksgiving dinner filled with family tension and judgment, an elderly black man is told to sit on the floor. But what happens next will leave everyone in the room, and you, speechless. Hold on tight as this shocking reveal uncovers the untold truth about who really owns the estate. This isn't just a holiday surprise. It's a game-changing revelation that will make you question everything you thought you knew. You won't believe your eyes. Watch until the end. The sun was dipping below the horizon as the Thanksgiving dinner began. The estate, an aging manor wrapped in ivy and ancient stone, stood as a monument to a bygone era. It had seen generations of the colonel's family, each one more eager than the last to maintain the wealth and status their ancestor had built. Inside, the grand dining room was an uneasy blend of old-world charm and modern pretension. The crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the polished oak table, laden with enough food to feed an army. Yet, despite the wealth and the grandeur, there was a palpable discomfort that hovered like a storm cloud in the room. At the far end of the table sat William. His frame was old now, the lines of his face etched by years of hard work and untold secrets. His suit, though well-maintained, was of an older cut, more suited to another time. He sat with a quiet dignity, observing the chaos around him, yet not fully a part of it. His daughter Clara, seated beside him, kept her eyes on the plate before her, avoiding the gazes of her family. She had invited her father here, but it had been clear from the moment he arrived that his presence would be more a curiosity than a welcome. There were too many old tensions, too many unspoken words between them all. William didn't seem to mind, though. He had never been one for the noise of the world. The family, on the other hand, was far from comfortable. Edward, the eldest son of the estate's current owners, sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid and self-assured. He was the natural leader, or so he thought, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a subtle but dismissive glance at his father's former employee. William had been a fixture of the estate when Edward was a child, but the years had transformed the old man into something different, something both distant and unfamiliar. The truth, however, was that Edward had never really understood William, and he didn't particularly care to. To him, the man sitting quietly at the table was nothing more than a reminder of an era long past, an uncomfortable relic that didn't quite fit the shiny, modern vision Edward had for the family's future. Lily, Edward's younger sister, was seated next to him, but her thoughts were far from the Thanksgiving feast. She glanced at William occasionally, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to the conversation at hand. She didn't like Edward's domineering attitude, but she didn't dare challenge him. Not yet. She had other plans, quieter plans, ones that had been carefully set in motion in the shadows of this very house. Lily wasn't naive. She understood what power meant, and she knew that power was often about being in the right place at the right time. At the moment, she simply waited, patiently, for her turn to speak. Sarah, the youngest of the siblings, wasn't as cold or calculating as her older brother and sister, but she was just as conflicted. She knew in some way that the family's wealth, what little of it was left, was built on old foundations, ones that were slowly crumbling away. She had always felt a kind of guilt, an unease about the land and the way it had been obtained. The estate passed down from the colonel had its history in the blood and sweat of others, people like William. Sarah never spoke of it openly, but she'd often caught herself looking at him during family gatherings, wondering what it would be like if things had been different. The clinking of silverware against porcelain interrupted her thoughts. Edward was speaking now, his voice confident, perhaps a little too confident for someone who wasn't used to being challenged. "We can't keep pretending this place is worth anything," he said, motioning around the room with a sweeping hand. "The world's changing. This estate's nothing but a liability. It's time to modernize, time to turn it into something profitable. I'm already talking to developers. This place could be worth millions if we let go of the past." Lily stiffened at the mention of selling the estate. She didn't dislike Edward's vision, but she had her own. As far as she was concerned, the estate should remain in the family, yes, but not under his control. Not when she had plans of her own. She wasn't blind to the way Edward was always at the forefront, always calling the shots. That had to change. She had her own way of doing things. Selling it? Sarah echoed quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. This is where we grew up, Edward. This is… She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she stared at her plate, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. Edward, oblivious to the strain in Sarah's voice, continued with his agenda. The world's moved on. People don't want mansions like this anymore. They want resorts. A modern upscale destination. We'll make millions. Who cares about some old memories? We need to think about the future. William didn't speak up, not yet. He hadn't said a word since sitting down, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Clara caught his eye, offering him a small, apologetic smile. But William's gaze didn't waver. His silence was as much a statement as any words could have been. He had never been a man to argue over trivialities, not in public. But there was something in the air tonight, something beneath the surface that was too heavy to ignore. For a moment the room was quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the chandelier overhead, as if the house itself was waiting. Then, finally, William spoke. His voice was deep but measured. I've always preferred standing, but I don't mind sitting here. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a subtle challenge that caused the conversation to falter for just a moment. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and she gave him a look, something between a warning and a plea. She didn't want her father to stir the pot, not now, not in front of the family. Edward's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. I don't know what you're talking about, old man, he said with a slight sneer, the insult thinly veiled. Maybe you should just relax and enjoy the food. But William remained unmoved. His gaze shifted slightly, taking in the room with a quiet authority. This house has seen a great deal of history, he said, his words slow but deliberate. More than you know, I suspect. At the mention of history, Clara felt a sudden tightness in her chest. Her father's words had a way of making things feel weightier than they were, and there was something in his tone that made her nervous. It was the same tone he used when he talked about their past, when he spoke of the family they'd left behind. The silence at the table grew thicker, and for a brief moment it was as if time had stopped. Clara's heart raced. She knew what was coming, and yet she wasn't ready. Not yet. The room was about to change forever. The air in the dining room grew heavier as the seconds ticked by. Edward shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing at William. His thin veneer of politeness was quickly crumbling. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his voice laced with an edge of contempt. Are you trying to lecture us now? You're just an old man who used to work here. William didn't flinch. His eyes were steady, unwavering. He'd seen far worse in his life. Clara could feel the tension rising in her chest, but she didn't dare look at her father. She kept her eyes trained on her plate, hoping that somehow the storm would pass. She wanted to tell him to be quiet, to let it go, but she knew deep down that there was something more at stake here than a family argument over dinner. William's voice, when it came, was calm and measured. I don't need to lecture anyone, Edward, he said, each word deliberate, as if weighing the impact before he spoke it. But this estate, this land, it means something more than what you're willing to acknowledge. More than money. More than your development schemes. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard her father speak with such quiet intensity in front of the family. The William she knew was always gentle with his words, always careful not to disturb the balance. But now, he was saying things she wasn't sure she was ready to hear, things that had been buried deep for far too long. Edward's laugh was a harsh bark. You think anyone cares about the past, William? This place is a relic. People don't want history, they want progress. We need to make this place profitable again, or it's just gonna fall into ruin. The word ruin stung more than Edward realized. William had spent decades here, working the land, watching it change. He remembered when the fields were alive with crops, the trees thick with fruit, the house bustling with life. The Colonel had built this place with blood and sweat, his vision a future tied to his name. But the Colonel's vision had never been Edward's. There was a long pause, and for a moment it seemed as if the conversation would die there. But then, without warning, William stood. His movement was slow but deliberate, his stiff joints betraying his age. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "I was once a young man, like you," William said, his voice now carrying across the room, quiet but powerful. "I worked this land with my hands. The Colonel, he was a hard man, but he had a vision, just like you. He wanted more than what this land had to offer. But he also understood something that you've forgotten. It's not just the land that matters, it's the people, the legacy." He paused, his eyes meeting Clara's for a brief, telling moment. "And I'm a part of that legacy, Edward." Edward's expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped, standing up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound jarring in the tense silence. "What legacy? You're just an old man who cleaned up the place and made it look pretty. You don't own anything here. You never did." William's gaze hardened, and he took a step forward, his movements deliberate and unwavering. "I never wanted to own anything, Edward," he said quietly. "But I have a right to it. This estate, it's mine." Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had heard fragments of this over the years, stories her father would tell her late at night when the world was quiet. She had always assumed they were just that, stories. But there was something in the way William spoke now, something in his voice that made her wonder if the truth was much larger than she could have imagined. Edward scoffed, clearly not taking William's words seriously. "You're delusional. What? You think the Colonel's will is going to magically put you in charge of this place?" His voice rose, becoming more mocking with every syllable. "You're not even family, William. You were just a hired hand. That's it." But William stood his ground. The quiet intensity in his eyes was enough to silence the room for a moment. Clara could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. She had no idea how much of this her father had carried with him, how much had been hidden for so long. She had always known he had been close to the Colonel, that the older man had trusted him, but there was more to it. Something more that William hadn't shared with her, or anyone else. "What if I told you," William continued, "that I was named the heir to this estate, that I was supposed to inherit everything your family now calls theirs? What if I told you that this land was always meant to be mine?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Edward froze, his mouth half open, as if unsure of how to respond. Lily's face, which had been carefully neutral until now, tightened in disbelief. Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Clara looked up at her father, the shock on her face mirroring her siblings. For a long moment, no one spoke. The family's quiet murmurings from earlier were now replaced with the weight of an unspoken question. "Is this true?" Finally, Edward found his voice again, though it was quieter now, edged with suspicion. "You're lying," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "There's no way the Colonel would have left you in charge of this estate. He was always clear about his family, his bloodline." William's lips tightened into a thin, unreadable line. "The Colonel wasn't always clear about his bloodline," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something deeper, darker. "But he was clear about one thing. This estate was meant to stay within his family, and when I left, I did it for your family's sake. But now, the truth is coming to light." Clara's heart raced, and her stomach twisted. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. She glanced nervously at Edward, at Lily, at Sarah. They were all looking at her now, waiting for her to say something, to make sense of what had just been revealed. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you mean?" "It's yours." William looked at his daughter, his eyes softening. "The Colonel left everything to me. He made it clear in his will, though it was never read, never acknowledged. I could have taken this estate when I left, but I didn't. I thought it was better to walk away. But now I have nothing left to lose." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her world, her understanding of her family, was beginning to fracture. She had always thought of the estate as something her father had walked away from, something distant, a past he was no longer a part of. But this was different. This was a truth she wasn't prepared to face. Edward was still standing, his face flushed with anger, but his eyes were wide with confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had always seen the estate as his birthright, his future. To hear that it might not be was something he couldn't yet process. Clara stood up slowly, her mind spinning. She felt as if the floor had been pulled out from under her, her reality turned upside down. She glanced at William, then at her siblings, wondering how they would react. What would this mean for them, for their family? And most importantly, what would it mean for her? The answers, she realized, were not going to come easily. Not tonight. Not without a reckoning. The room was thick with tension, each breath in the air feeling heavier than the last. Clara's mind raced, but she didn't speak. Instead, she felt the weight of her father's revelation pressing down on her, filling the space between her and her siblings like a wall that couldn't be ignored. The estate, the family, the legacy. She had always thought she understood her place in this world, had always thought the past was something her father had left behind. But now, with William's quiet declaration, the past wasn't so distant. It was here, sitting at their dinner table, forcing them to confront what they had all been trying to forget. Edward's face was flushed, but his anger had been replaced by confusion, his mind struggling to keep up with the truth being laid bare before him. He opened and closed his mouth several times, as if trying to form words but finding none that fit. Finally, he looked at Clara, his voice shaky but determined. "Clara, tell me this is some kind of joke," he said, his gaze not leaving her face. "You can't possibly believe this. It's absurd." Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes locked on her father, then drifting briefly over to Sarah, who was sitting wide-eyed, her hand clutching her glass as though she might shatter it. Sarah, always so emotional, looked as though she were seeing her family for the first time, struggling to reconcile the man who had raised her with the startling truth William had just revealed. "I don't know what to believe," Clara finally said, her voice hoarse as she spoke. "But Dad—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence. How could she even begin to process what he had just said? That the estate, the place they had all grown up in, might not belong to them at all. That everything they had ever taken for granted, every heirloom, every legacy, every dollar, might be a lie? Lily, who had been quiet up until now, cleared her throat, her eyes sharp as she looked at William. "So what now?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, as if she had already been thinking of the next step. "You just expect us to hand everything over to you? After all these years? This estate is ours, William. We've been running it for generations. Your claim, your will, doesn't change that." William's expression hardened, his gaze cold now as he met Lily's challenge. "It's not about what you think you've been running, Lily," he said quietly, the words cutting through the air. "It's about what's been kept hidden. The Colonel's will was never meant to be seen by your family, but it was meant to be seen by me. And it's been here all along. I just never wanted to disturb the peace you thought you had." There was a pause as Lily processed the words. "The peace we thought we had?" she repeated, her voice low, almost a whisper. "So this is what it's all about? A will that you've kept hidden for decades? You think we're just supposed to hand over everything because of some old man's last words?" Her eyes flashed with something darker now. Resentment, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. "You think we're going to just forget what we've built here?" Clara winced at her sister's words. Lily's bitterness was palpable, but there was something deeper in her anger. Clara had always known that Lily resented Edward's role as the heir, that she resented being overlooked for leadership. But this was something more. Lily had always been about control, and now, with the revelation of William's inheritance, Clara couldn't help but wonder if her sister was more worried about losing her grip on the estate than she was about the truth itself. "You don't get it, do you, Lily?" Sarah interjected, her voice small but steady. "This isn't just about the estate, it's about us, about the family. If what Dad's saying is true, then everything we've believed, everything we've built, it's all based on a lie." Her words hung in the air, a quiet accusation that hung between them all. "We can't just keep pretending things are okay. We can't keep ignoring the truth." Lily shot her a look, but Sarah didn't back down. There was a new sharpness in her that Clara hadn't seen before, a strength, perhaps, that had been hidden beneath her gentle demeanor for so long. It was almost as if the weight of their father's revelation had unlocked something deep inside her, something that had been buried along with the family's past. "I'm not saying we forget the past," William said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived through far worse than this. "But we can't keep pretending this is all there is. You all want to sell it, tear it apart, make money off of it. But it's not yours to sell. This land has its own history, its own story, and it's time the truth came to light." Clara felt a chill run through her as her father's words settled on her shoulders. She knew deep down that he was right, but she also knew how difficult it would be for the family to accept it. Her mother had left the family when Clara was young, leaving her father to raise her on his own. And despite their shared love and respect for the estate, there had always been an unspoken divide between William and his children, between the world they had inherited and the one he had walked away from. The realization hit Clara like a wave, and she felt suddenly adrift in the sea of her own thoughts. The past wasn't something that could be neatly boxed up and ignored anymore. It was a part of who they were, of who she was. She had always tried to keep her father's history separate from her own, to keep the secrets of their family hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. But now, that veneer was cracking, and there was no way to put it back together. "I can't believe this," Edward muttered, shaking his head, his voice tight with frustration. "This is insane. This is our family, our legacy." "Not anymore," William replied softly. "Not the way you think." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. No one spoke, each person retreating into their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the storm that had just been unleashed. Clara could feel the weight of her father's words pressing down on her, suffocating her. The history she had once believed in, the one that had been passed down through generations, was now something different. It wasn't hers anymore. It was his. After what felt like an eternity, Clara finally stood. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, as if the ground itself had shifted. She needed to get away, to clear her head. But before she could move, William placed a hand on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone of his age. "Clara," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There's more you need to know. The Colonel's will, it wasn't just about the estate, it was about the future. Your future. And it's time you learned the whole truth." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The future. Her future. What did that even mean? What had her father done? What had he hidden from her all these years? And why had he waited so long to tell her? Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, her father's grip steady on her arm, holding her in place. His words, heavy with unspoken implications, echoed in her mind. The future. Your future. What did he mean? For years she had lived with a quiet understanding of who she was in this family, a daughter of William, a member of the estate, but nothing more than a bystander to its larger, ever-looming legacy. But now, as the weight of his revelation settled deeper into her bones, Clara realized she hadn't known anything at all. The room had grown eerily quiet, everyone watching the exchange, but no one daring to interrupt. Edward, still standing, had crossed his arms and was staring at the ground, his jaw clenched in frustration. Lily, always the one to hold control over her emotions, now seemed unsettled, her eyes darting between Clara and their father. Sarah, meanwhile, hadn't said a word since her last remark. She simply sat there, her face pale, processing the enormity of what had just been revealed. Clara finally tore her gaze away from her father's hand on her arm and looked up at him, her voice trembling, but determined. "What do you mean, Dad? What truth are you talking about?" Her question hung in the air like a taut rope demanding an answer. William's eyes softened as he looked at her, but there was a sadness in them that she had never seen before. "Clara, there's so much you don't know," he began, his voice quieter now, though the room was still filled with a tense anticipation. "This estate, it's not just about land and buildings. It's not just about the colonel and the family that came before. It's about something much bigger, something that's been passed down for generations, but it's something the colonel kept hidden, even from his own family. It's something I've kept hidden because I thought it would be better if you didn't know." Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had never known her father to keep secrets, at least not ones that were important, and the way he was speaking now, as though everything she thought she knew about her own family was built on sand, made her feel suddenly small, like a child being told a bedtime story that no longer made sense. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. William took a deep breath, his eyes flickering to the other members of the family who were still waiting for him to explain. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but filled with years of regret. "Your mother left because she couldn't live with the burden anymore, Clara. And when she left, I thought it would be better for you to be raised in ignorance. But it's time you knew the truth. You're not just my daughter. You're the heir to this estate. You've always been the heir." Clara blinked, stunned. She felt like the room had spun around her, like she was falling through the floor as if the very ground beneath her feet had been yanked away. "What? No, that's impossible. I'm not. How could I be?" "You are," William replied, his voice gentle but firm. "The colonel made sure of it. He didn't just leave me the estate. He left it to you. It was always meant to be yours, but he knew that I would need to raise you, teach you, and prepare you for what was to come. And I've failed you in that, Clara. I've kept you from your own legacy." Clara's mind reeled. She stumbled back a step, feeling the air grow thick in her lungs. She had never considered herself as the successor to the estate, not once. Even as a child, she had always known her brother's birthright, had always been told by her family that it was Edward who would take the reins. But now her father was telling her that she had always been the true heir. "No," Edward snapped, the words cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. "This is insane. I've spent my entire life preparing for this. I've worked for this estate, and now you're telling me it's all been a lie? That she," he pointed at Clara, "is the heir? You're just going to pass everything to her?" Clara couldn't look at her brother. His anger was boiling over, and she could feel the heat of it across the room. This wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about power, about everything they had all believed to be true, shattered in an instant. Edward's world, the one he had meticulously constructed for himself, was crumbling, and he couldn't bear it. "Edward, please," Clara whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I didn't know. I didn't ask for this. I don't even know what this means." Edward's face reddened with rage. "It doesn't matter if you asked for it, Clara. You don't deserve this. I've earned this. All my life I've worked for this family, for this estate, for everything we have." His voice cracked on the last words, and for a brief moment, Clara saw the vulnerability behind his anger. "And now you're telling me it was always meant to be hers?" Lily, who had been silent for much of the exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was quieter now, but there was a steely edge to it. "We need to see the will," she said, her words crisp. "This can't be true unless we see the actual document. If the colonel really left everything to Clara, then we'll need to see proof. We'll need to understand how and why he would make such a decision." "Lily's right," Edward muttered, his anger giving way to a more calculating coldness. "Until we see that will, I'm not believing any of this, and it sounds like a fairy tale. There's no way the colonel would have left everything to Clara and not told anyone." William nodded slowly, his face shadowed with regret. "I understand, but I don't have the will with me. I'll need to get it. I'll take you to the lawyer's office where it's been stored, but you need to understand. There's more to this than just the inheritance." Lily crossed her arms, her gaze never leaving William. "What do you mean by that?" she asked sharply, the tension still thick in her voice. "More than just the inheritance? What else are you hiding?" William hesitated. his eyes flicking briefly to Clara before lowering to the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of years spent keeping secrets. The Colonel's will was never just about passing down property or wealth. It was about protecting something. Something that, until now, none of you have been ready to understand. And there's no way to explain it all unless you're prepared to face what's been kept in the shadows. Clara's pulse quickened. What could he mean? What could be so important, so dangerous that it had been hidden for decades? "I'll take you to the lawyer's office tomorrow," William said, breaking the silence that had settled over them all. "But I won't force any of you to take part in this if you're not ready. The truth, it has a way of changing everything." Clara didn't know whether she was ready, but one thing was certain. Her life, her family, and the estate that she had always thought was her past were now tangled in a mystery she couldn't ignore, and she was about to uncover everything. The next day, Clara hardly slept. Her mind spun with questions, each one tumbling into the next, until they became a tangled web she could no longer untangle. The quiet hum of the house, the low murmur of distant voices, all felt like echoes from a past that no longer existed. William's words, the weight of them, the finality of his revelation, kept repeating in her mind like a drumbeat, each pulse louder than the last. "You're the heir. It's always been yours." The past she had known, the life she had taken for granted, was suddenly not what it seemed. And if what her father said was true, the very foundation of her family's existence was built on a lie. The house felt empty that morning, though it wasn't. The family was still here, still processing the night before, but Clara felt alone. Edward had stormed off after dinner, retreating to his study, and Lily had been unnervingly quiet, her thoughts hidden behind a cold mask. Sarah, who had been the most affected by William's words, seemed almost lost, her usual gentleness replaced by a quiet determination to understand. She'd spoken little, but Clara had seen the questions in her eyes, the same ones that plagued her. The only sound that seemed to anchor her in the silence of the morning was the creak of the floorboards as Clara walked downstairs to meet her father. William had left early, before anyone else had risen, to go to the lawyer's office. He had promised to return with the will, the key to unlocking everything, and Clara could feel the weight of that promise pressing on her chest like a stone. The uncertainty of the night before had only deepened overnight. When Clara entered the dining room, where breakfast had been laid out, she found Sarah sitting at the table, her hands clasped around a cup of coffee, her gaze distant. She looked up as Clara approached, offering a tentative smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You okay?" Clara asked, sitting down across from her. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything. It feels like we've been living in someone else's story." She took a slow sip of her coffee, her fingers shaking ever so slightly as she set the mug down. "It's hard to believe, Clara. But last night, the way Dad spoke, it felt real, it felt like the truth." Clara nodded, her stomach twisting. "I know. I've never seen him like that before. He looked, I don't know, almost regretful, like he was telling us something he never wanted to." Sarah looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Do you believe him?" Clara's eyes darted to the window, where the morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows across the room. "I don't know what to believe. It doesn't feel real. How could it? I've spent my whole life thinking I was just me, the daughter of William. But now it's like everything's shifting under my feet." Sarah reached across the table and took Clara's hand, a gesture of comfort. "We'll figure it out. We have to." Clara squeezed her hand, grateful for the simple reassurance. She didn't know what they would uncover when William returned. All she knew was that it had to be the truth. It had to be, because if it wasn't, then nothing made sense anymore. Just then a car pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching against the gravel. Clara's heart skipped a beat. William was back. The door creaked open and William entered carrying a thick envelope. He didn't smile, didn't offer any greeting. Instead, his eyes met Clara's, his expression solemn. He placed the envelope on the table between them, his hands trembling slightly. "Here it is," he said quietly. "The will." Clara's pulse quickened as she reached for the envelope, her fingers cold. The room felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Sarah, who had been watching William intently, now leaned forward, her hands clasped together tightly. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked, her voice unsteady. "I mean, this is real, right? This is really what the Colonel wanted?" William nodded, his gaze unwavering. "This is the truth, Clara. It's time you knew everything." Clara tore open the envelope, her heart hammering in her chest. Inside there was a single sheet of paper, its edges yellowed with age. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the words printed in elegant script. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the first line. "To my beloved William and to my legacy, I leave everything I have, and more. My wealth, my property, my name, all of it is yours, but it is only yours by the will of my daughter, Clara." Clara's eyes blurred as she continued reading, the words becoming a blur of confusion and disbelief. The Colonel had not only left her the estate, he had made her the custodian of his entire legacy. It wasn't just the land, it wasn't just the house, it was everything. The Colonel's fortune, his name, his legacy, all of it was tied to her, not to Edward, not to William, but to her. The letter went on to explain that Clara's inheritance was more than just material wealth. It was a responsibility. The Colonel had believed that the estate needed to remain in the hands of someone who understood its true value, someone who could protect it and carry it forward. It was a legacy that had been passed down through generations, a legacy tied to a secret so deep it had never been shared with anyone, not even his own family. Clara's mind was reeling. She had always thought of the estate as a place, a thing that belonged to her family, to her father, to her brother. But this was something else entirely. This was about the Colonel's vision for the future, his belief in her, a belief she had never known existed. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Why me? Why not Edward? Why not you, Dad?" William's face softened and he sat down beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Because, Clara, you are the one who can carry this legacy. You always have been. Your mother left because she couldn't bear the burden. But you were always meant to take this on." Clara shook her head, the confusion in her eyes giving way to a mix of disbelief and fear. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know what it means. I'm not ready." "You don't have to do it alone," William said, his voice warm, reassuring. "You'll have time to learn. You'll have time to understand the true responsibility of this place. But now, you have a choice. You can keep this legacy alive, or you can let it fade away." Clara felt the enormity of the decision weighing on her, the future of the estate, and of her family, now resting on her shoulders. The question was no longer whether she was ready. The question was whether she could live up to the Colonel's trust, to the legacy that had been thrust upon her. And deep down, she knew the answer wasn't just about the estate. It was about everything that had led them here, every secret that had been buried, every lie that had been told. Because the Colonel hadn't just left her an inheritance, he had left her the power to change everything. The question now was, what would she do with it? The weight of the will still hung heavily in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Clara's fingers trembled as she folded the letter back into the envelope, as if doing so might somehow shield her from the reality of what it meant. She sat still for a moment, staring at the envelope in her lap, trying to steady her racing thoughts. William had been right about one thing. The estate wasn't just land, wealth, or power. It was a legacy. And now it was hers, or so the Colonel had decreed. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the clock ticking away the seconds. Sarah had retreated into her own thoughts, her fingers still clasped tightly around her coffee cup, while William's gaze remained fixed on Clara, waiting for her to speak, to react. But what was there to say? Could she really accept this inheritance, this burden, knowing it came with so many unknowns? Finally, Clara looked up at her father. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" The question had been building inside her since the moment she read the will, but it came out in a whisper, a plea for understanding. Why keep this from me all this time? William's expression softened, his eyes filled with the weight of years spent keeping secrets. "I wanted to protect you, Clara. From the truth, from the burden, from the responsibility. I thought if you didn't know, you could live a normal life. I thought I could shield you from all the darkness that comes with carrying the legacy of this place." He paused, a hint of regret creeping into his voice. "But I was wrong. I should have told you when you were ready, not when it was too late." Clara's heart ached at his words. She had never truly understood the pressure her father had lived under, the silent toll it had taken on him. He had always been distant, always hiding something, but she had never known just how deep the secrets ran. And now, with the truth laid bare before her, she was left to grapple with it all. "So, all these years, and you've been preparing me without me even knowing? For what?" William sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not exactly preparing you, but yes. The Colonel always believed that you would inherit. He saw something in you that the rest of us didn't. He was waiting for you to come of age, waiting for you to understand what was at stake." He glanced at Sarah, then back at Clara. "There are things you don't know, things the Colonel never had the chance to explain, and I wasn't in any position to help you understand them, not until you were ready. But now," he looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear, "now it's time for you to decide." Clara swallowed, trying to push down the gnawing anxiety in her chest. The estate, her family's future, her own future, it was all suddenly entwined in a way she couldn't ignore. "I'm not ready for this, Dad. I don't know if I ever will be." "You don't have to do it alone," William repeated, his voice low and firm. "You have us. You have your family. And you have time to learn. But the Colonel, he left something behind, something hidden here. Something that was meant to be found only when you were ready to take it on. You've always had the potential, Clara, but now you must decide if you want to accept that responsibility or walk away." A cold shiver ran through Clara. The responsibility of the estate was one thing, but the responsibility of the truth about the Colonel, about the legacy, about the secrets buried deep within the walls of the house, was another matter entirely. She had always believed that the estate was just a symbol of family tradition, but it was becoming clear that it was more than that. It was a place of power, of history, and of dangers that had been hidden for generations. The silence in the room stretched long before Clara spoke again. "What is it? What's hidden here?" William looked away, his gaze drifting to the large window that overlooked the estate. For a moment, Clara wondered if he was going to answer, but then his eyes returned to her, filled with an unmistakable urgency. "It's not something I can explain easily. Not yet. But there are people, Clara. People who have been watching this place for years, waiting for the right time. And the Colonel, he protected something here, something they want, and now it's yours to protect." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, people who have been watching? Who are they? And what did the Colonel protect?" William took a deep breath, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "The Colonel's legacy isn't just about wealth or land, Clara. It's about something far more valuable. Something that people would kill to get their hands on. That's why I kept the truth from you. Why I never told you. Because if you knew, you'd be a target, and I didn't want that for you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "A target? For what?" William hesitated. "It's not just about the estate. It's about what the estate contains. There's something buried here, a secret, long hidden by the Colonel, something that could change everything. And there are people who have been trying to find it for years." Clara shook her head, trying to make sense of what he was saying. The estate, her inheritance, was more than just a home, more than just a piece of land. It was a key to something dark and powerful, something her father had kept from her all these years. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice shaky with fear. "Why now?" "Because now," William said quietly, "you're the only one who can protect it. And if you're going to take on this legacy, you need to know everything. The good, the bad, and the dangerous. And there's a lot more danger than I ever wanted you to face." Clara stood up abruptly, the room spinning around her. She couldn't take it. She had come into this conversation thinking she was just going to hear about some old will, some inheritance that would settle her father's legacy. But this was something far bigger, far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. "I need time," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I need time to think. I can't. This is too much." Her father nodded, his expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. "I know, but time is something we might not have. You're already being watched. I can feel it. They're out there, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Clara's stomach churned. Her family's past was no longer a distant memory. It was a present threat, and she was right in the center of it. The future of the estate, her family's legacy, and her own life now rested on a single, terrifying question. Could she protect it? And who, or what, was waiting in the shadows ready to take it all from her? The day after William's revelation, the atmosphere at the estate grew even more oppressive. Clara could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her as if the walls themselves were closing in, holding secrets she wasn't ready to understand. She spent the entire morning pacing the rooms, trying to make sense of the words her father had spoken. The estate, the legacy, the danger, it all felt like too much to bear. Yet, somewhere deep inside her, Clara knew she couldn't walk away from this. It wasn't just about the estate or the power it held. It was about her family, the ties that bound them all together, even if those ties were built on lies and hidden truths. That afternoon, Clara met with William in the library, a massive room lined with bookshelves that seemed to stretch on forever. The scent of old paper and leather filled the air, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. She had spent hours reading through the will again, trying to glean some deeper meaning from the Colonel's words. But the more she read, the more confused she became. Every sentence seemed to hint at something she wasn't supposed to know, and her father's warning still echoed in her mind. "There are people watching. You're a target now." "I'm ready," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence. She had made up her mind. Whatever this legacy was, whatever the Colonel had hidden, she would face it head on. She owed it to herself and to the memory of her mother to uncover the truth. William looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure? This is bigger than you think, Clara. I didn't tell you everything last night because some things are still too dangerous to reveal." Clara nodded, her determination unwavering. "I don't care about the danger anymore, Dad. I need to know. I need to understand what's going on. You said there are people out there. Who are they? Why would they want what's buried here?" William hesitated, looking down at the old wooden desk in front of him, his hands clasped tightly together. For a long moment, Clara thought he might not answer, but then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. "It's not just the estate, Clara. The Colonel's fortune, his land, his name, they were just a part of the bigger picture. There's something deeper, something ancient that he protected. And there are organizations, people, who would do anything to get their hands on it. It's not something they can own. It's something they want to control." Clara frowned. "Control? What does that even mean?" William's voice grew even quieter, as if the words themselves might be dangerous. "The Colonel didn't just accumulate wealth or power. He found something. Something that has been hidden for centuries. And when he took control of this estate, he became its guardian, its protector. But when he died, it was supposed to pass to you. Because, Clara, you're the only one who can understand it. The legacy, the power, it's always been tied to you." Clara stared at her father, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to fall into place. "What is it, Dad? What did he protect?" For a moment, William looked as though he might say more, but then he stopped, his expression shifting to one of caution. It's a secret, Clara. One that's been passed down through generations, hidden beneath the estate, beneath these very grounds. The colonel swore an oath to protect it, and now that oath is yours. But the people who are after it don't care about oaths. They care about power, and they will stop at nothing to find it. Clara felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. The weight of her inheritance, the power, the responsibility, the danger. It was all beginning to feel too much to handle. What do I do, Dad? How do I protect something I don't even understand? William stood up and moved toward the window, his silhouette framed by the gray sky outside. The first step is to understand what the colonel left behind. It's hidden somewhere in the estate, somewhere you've never thought to look. But you're going to need help, Clara. You can't do this alone. Clara's mind raced. The estate was vast, a sprawling labyrinth of rooms and hallways, gardens and hidden corners. How could she possibly find something so elusive, so valuable, without knowing where to even begin? Who can help me? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. William turned back toward her, his expression filled with uncertainty. There's someone who can help you. Someone who knows more about the estate's history than anyone else. Someone I've kept from you until now. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Who? His name is Daniel, William said, his voice heavy with meaning. He's a historian, a researcher who's been studying the colonel's life for years. I didn't want you to meet him before because I wasn't sure you were ready. But now, you need him, Clara. He knows where to look. He knows the stories, the clues the colonel left behind. But you must trust him. You must let him guide you. The mention of this Daniel felt like the final key to unlocking the mystery. Clara didn't know who he was or how he had come to be involved with her family's history, but she knew one thing for certain. She had no choice but to trust her father. It was the only way forward. Where is he? Clara asked, standing up from her seat, her mind made up. William hesitated for a moment before answering. He's staying in a small cabin on the edge of the estate grounds. I'll take you to him. Clara nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment she could begin to uncover the truth about the colonel, about her inheritance, and about the people who were watching, waiting, and plotting to take it all away. As they left the library, Clara's pulse quickened with anticipation. Her father led her through the corridors of the estate, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he were walking through a place he no longer recognized. The estate was alive with history, but it was also a place of deep shadows, of secrets buried beneath the soil and between the walls. When they reached the cabin, it was a small, weathered building tucked away at the far edge of the grounds, surrounded by trees. There was a certain stillness to it, as though time had stopped in this part of the estate. As they approached, Clara could feel a palpable sense of something ancient, something waiting, just beyond her reach. William knocked on the door, and when it opened, Clara's breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man in his late 30s, tall and lean, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity to him that made Clara instantly wary. "Daniel," William said, his voice low. "This is my daughter, Clara." The man, Daniel, looked at Clara with a sharp, appraising gaze. "I've been waiting for you." Clara's heart raced. The time had come. The truth was within reach, and with Daniel's help she would finally uncover what the colonel had protected. But she also knew that uncovering it would come with a price. The evening sun dipped low behind the trees as Clara and William followed Daniel into the small, secluded cabin. The moment Clara stepped inside, she was struck by the contrast between the rustic exterior and the surprisingly well-organized interior. The cabin was filled with bookshelves, dusty tomes stacked high on every surface, their leather spines worn with age. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a large wooden desk was littered with maps, old photographs, and yellowing manuscripts. The air smelled faintly of paper and tobacco, a musty but oddly comforting scent that immediately made Clara feel like she had crossed some threshold, one she wasn't sure she could turn back from. Daniel led them to the center of the room, where a large map of the estate was pinned to the wall. He gestured for them to sit at a small table near the fireplace, its surface covered with old journals and handwritten notes. Clara, still processing everything she had learned, sat down hesitantly, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. William took a seat across from her, his face drawn and serious, as if the weight of what they were about to discuss was heavier than anything he had ever carried before. Daniel remained standing, his back to them as he studied the map with a look of deep concentration. "This place is older than you think, Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "The estate itself, the land, it has secrets buried deep within it, secrets that go back hundreds of years. The colonel wasn't just a collector of wealth or a man of power. He was a keeper of something much older, something that even I've only begun to understand." Clara looked at William, who met her gaze with a grim expression. "I've kept Daniel close all these years because I knew one day we'd need him. The colonel's legacy wasn't just about the estate. It was about protecting something that could change the world, something that could be used for good or evil. And now, Clara, it's your turn to decide." Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I'm not even sure I understand what it is I'm supposed to protect. What does all of this mean? What's hidden here?" Daniel turned, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "The colonel believed in the power of knowledge, Clara, of the mind. The secret he guarded wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a source of knowledge, something that could reshape history. He kept it hidden here, on this estate, because he knew that if it fell into the wrong hands, it could lead to destruction. That's why he chose you." Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. The more Daniel spoke, the more it became clear that she wasn't just inheriting land or wealth. She was inheriting something far more dangerous, something that had the potential to change everything she thought she knew about the world. "I don't understand." "What kind of knowledge?" Daniel walked to the desk, picking up a worn notebook. "This is part of the answer," he said, holding it up. "The colonel never fully trusted anyone, not even me, with the entirety of the story. But I've spent years piecing things together. This journal, one of many, contains references to something the colonel called the key. It's not a physical object, but a series of encrypted writings, ancient languages, that once unlocked, could open a door to knowledge that has been hidden from mankind for centuries." Clara frowned. "What kind of knowledge? Why didn't he just share it? Why hide it all?" William sighed deeply. "Because it's dangerous, Clara. It's not something anyone should wield without understanding the consequences. The colonel knew that power like this can corrupt, it can destroy. He thought you might be the one to protect it, to keep it from falling into the wrong hands." Daniel's gaze softened as he looked at Clara. "It's not just about keeping secrets. It's about preserving a balance. The colonel hid the truth in a way that only someone truly connected to the estate, someone like you, could understand. That's why he left it all to you. He believed that you had the potential to guard it, to figure it out in a way that others couldn't." Clara's thoughts were spinning. "And these people, these groups you spoke about, who are they? Why would they want this knowledge? What could they do with it?" Daniel's face darkened. "There are factions, some with good intentions, some with darker motives. Some want the knowledge for power, to control nations. Others want it for greed, to gain wealth beyond imagination. But there are those who believe that this knowledge could cure diseases, end poverty, even reverse the damage done to the environment. It's that powerful. But it's a double-edged sword. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything." Clara felt a chill run through her. The weight of what she was hearing settled heavily on her shoulders. The estate was no longer just a home. It was a battleground, a place of immense power that could shape the future, either for good or for ill. And now it was her responsibility to protect it. She looked at her father, the man who had kept this secret from her for so long, and found no easy answers in his tired eyes. "So what now?" What do I do with this knowledge? How do I protect something that could change the world? What if I'm not the one to guard it properly? William reached across the table and grasped her hand, his grip firm but gentle. You don't have to do this alone. You'll have Daniel's help. You'll have the resources you need. But most importantly, you'll have your family. We'll face this together as a unit. But you have to be willing to embrace it, Clara. You have to understand that this isn't just about you anymore. This is about everyone. The fate of the estate, of the knowledge it holds, is in your hands. Daniel nodded in agreement. The Colonel didn't trust many people, but he trusted you, Clara. That's why he left it to you. But time is running out. There are others who are already aware that the legacy is changing hands. You're not just inheriting an estate, you're inheriting a fight. The first step is understanding what the Colonel left behind. The second is keeping it safe. Clara sat back in her chair, the enormity of the situation sinking in. She had always thought that one day when she inherited the estate, her life would change. But she had never imagined this. The Colonel's legacy was more than wealth or land. It was a burden, one that carried with it immense responsibility, and it seemed that every moment she spent learning about it brought more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, she couldn't walk away from it now. There was no turning back. As Daniel unfurled a large map of the estate, he pointed to several locations. The first place we need to visit is the cellar beneath the main house, he said. It's the oldest part of the estate, and the Colonel believed that the key was hidden there, under layers of protection. That's where we start. Clara looked at the map, her eyes tracing the path that would lead her into the heart of the estate, where the past and present collided. The journey she had been thrust into was just beginning. The stakes were higher than she could have imagined, and the dangers, both known and unknown, lurked just beyond the walls. With a deep breath, Clara nodded. Let's go. Let's find the truth. As she stood and followed Daniel toward the door, Clara knew one thing for certain. Her life, as she knew it, was over. The woman who had walked into this cabin hours ago was not the same woman who would walk out. The legacy was now hers to protect, and she would stop at nothing to uncover its secrets. And as the door closed behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was already waiting for her at the other end of this journey.